Major funding for election 2016 AETN debates is provided by AARP Arkansas.
Good evening again. I'm Steve Barnes, and at this hour we conclude Debate Week here on the Arkansas Educational Television Network, AETN, with the race for the United States House of Representatives in the 2nd District. Our candidates in alphabetical order: Diane Curry of Little Rock, the Democratic nominee; Chris Hayes of Little Rock, the Libertarian Party candidate; and French Hill, the incumbent and Republican Party nominee. The candidates will be questioned tonight by a panel of Arkansas journalists, including Sarah Whites-Konachek of Arkansas Public Media, Lance Turner of Arkansas Business, and Steve Bronner, an independent Arkansas journalist. Each candidate will have 2 minutes for an opening statement. Each will have 2 minutes to respond to a question, while rebuttals are limited to 1 minute. And at the conclusion of tonight's appearance, each candidate will have 2 minutes for a closing statement. As always, the order of opening statements, questioning, rebuttals, closing statements, all determined prior to the broadcast by a drawing in which the candidates or their representatives participated. Our timekeeper tonight is Sandra Sherman of AETN. And with that, our first opening statement tonight, Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Thank you, Steve, Sarah, Lance. Thank you all for being here. I'd like to say a few things. Thank you, AETN, to those involved here, the staff and such, for making this possible to let all of us come talk. I'd like to let you know a little bit about me. If you haven't met me across the state at some point in time since I've been here most of my life, I grew up here in Arkansas. I have lived in other places, but I grew up here. This is where my passion is. This is where my family is. This is where what I call home is. I've moved back here in around 2007, and since that time, there have been a lot of changes, as we've all seen, across our nation, across our country, and across our state. For that reason, I got involved with politics. I hope to do something more. I'd like to leave our country with more freedom. I'd like to leave our children with less debt, and I would like to see our country going in a direction where we are the leaders of all men, not the followers, or not the people who are instituting changes in other regimes or governments. I think our foreign policy has absolutely stunk. I think the economy is almost doomed to fail, and I think we need to get hold of this as soon as possible. I am running for Congress to try and make as many changes as I can to introduce laws that will help to do this, or to actually eliminate laws that are in our way. I'd like to see many of the federal government's programs eliminated or greatly reduced. And I thank you for your time.
Mr. Hayes, thank you. Ms. Curry.
Good evening. And I want to say thank you to AETN for hosting this debate, and to Steve Barnes, the moderator, and to our reporters that have provided their time tonight. I want to say a special hello to Senator Pryor. Let him know that we are praying for his speedy recovery. I am elated to be the Democratic nominee for the Democratic Party of Arkansas for the 2nd Congressional District. As I have traveled the 2nd District, I've met some amazing men and women, and I'm truly elated that hopefully they will be able to better provide for their families. I know as a single mom and as a grandmother, I've had to work 2 jobs, and I know the difficulty that it is to help me make ends meet. I want to say, from some of the expressed concerns from the people that I met, they were concerned with whether or not they are getting the best quality of education for their children, whether or not they can pay their medical bills, whether or not they have a hospital in their community that's there to service the people in their small community. Also, I've met veterans on the way that we know so many of them are still not being served the way that they need. I would say to you, you have a choice today. at this election to vote a person that will be the voice for the 2nd Congressional District. Thank you.
Ms. Curry, thank you. Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Steve, and thank our panel for participating tonight, and appreciate the opportunity to be on the dais with our candidates tonight. My name is French Hill, and I've served in Congress for part of my first term, and appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight, talk about the issues, what I've heard since I've been in Washington. I was in business for 35 years, and what motivated me to run for Congress in 2014 and serve in my first term was the fact that we need to change direction on our economic policy and create more opportunities and jobs for our people. Here in the 7 counties of the Central Arkansas 2nd Congressional District, we have fewer people working in 4 of those counties than we did in the summer of 2007. So the economic recovery that's been anemic across the country has really been anemic here. So that's my top issue, working on the economy. Secondly, I've enjoyed working with our county judges, our mayors across the district, focusing on issues of importance to them. How do we create better roads, better opportunities for business and recruiting? How do we improve health care in our communities? And finally, I too have traveled the district and heard from many, many people. People who want better schools. How do we get more opportunities for our kids in the skilled workforce, have an alternative besides going just to college? And also, how do we get accountability in our Veterans Department and get the service that they deserve for the sacrifices they've made for our country? So with that, that's my concluding comments. Open us up. Steve, thank you.
Well, Mr. Hill, thank you very much. Our first question tonight comes from Sarah White-Skodachek of Arkansas Public Media. It goes first to Mr. Hill.
Representative Hill, Donald Trump says his 2005 statements bragging about groping women amount to locker room talk. How can Republican leaders who support Trump effectively condone this? Does it put you in the locker room?
Sarah, thanks for the question. You know, I think every woman, every American was offended by Donald Trump's remarks. They're indefensible, and that's why I think it was appropriate that he immediately apologized. But likewise, I think every American has been offended by particularly the last few months of Mrs. Clinton's cover-up of her challenges with her emails. It's clear that she's violated the Classified Information Act. She's violated the Federal Records Act. And so we have effectively 2 flawed candidates. But for me, after looking about what will move our economy forward, what's better for national security policy, what's better when I think about the status quo versus the future of our country, I come down to think what's in the best interest of our nation, and that's to vote for the Republican ticket.
Ms. Curry.
My rebuttal is that I feel that it's appalling that the Republicans in this state and across the nation could support the effort, especially with the slighting that's been done to women, Muslims, Latinos, and the disabled. I'm about inclusion. I would never be not about all people. So I think we have to come back to the table and be concerned with what's happening with all people. I'm embarrassed with the fact that our Republican opponent has not disclosed his income tax returns, because that doesn't indicate, am I paying my fair share of taxes? I know I have to pay mine, and many of you, everyone that's in the audience here. I just think that we have to work more together, and it's about the people in our nation to make it better. We are concerned with having a better job market, a job development opportunity, and just doing better for the working people in our state and in our nation.
Ms. Curry, thank you. Mr. Hayes, 2 minutes.
Personally, myself, I haven't actually heard what he said. I've seen some of the reports, things of this nature. Obviously, it's deplorable. I don't think it's limited to a party. I think it's a distraction, that we are being distracted from other purposes, other things that are going on. And I think really, yes, that is a very bad thing. I'd hate to know that I had said it, but I'm just saying that could be under anybody, under any party, anywhere. It is deplorable. I do not condone that behavior, and I believe most anybody who's ever been around any true ladies and has been a gentleman knows that that is not acceptable to a lady.
Mr. Hill, 1 minute rebuttal if you wish.
Well, I think I want to go back to the point that we've got two flawed candidates. But when you look at the issues of Mrs. Clinton's reputation as Secretary of State, her work as a senator, and what she's done over the last year as a candidate, she's misled the American people by her actions as Secretary of State regarding her classified information handling. She could well be guilty of perjury on that matter. And I don't have any doubt that that kind of corruption and reputation of disrespect is something that causes me to take very seriously how I look at the comparison. And I'll just conclude by saying again, if you look at the importance of getting this economy growing again, if you look at the issue of national security, homeland security, moving the country's future in a different direction, breaking with the status quo, I think the Republican ticket's the way to go.
Our next question comes from Mr. Lance Turner, and it goes first to Mr. Hayes.
Okay. Mr. Hayes, big banks have argued that government regulation after the financial collapse is too much. Smaller banks, though, that did not contribute to the financial crisis, including dozens in Arkansas, find themselves under the same regulatory demands as those that are, quote, too big to fail. How can you fix banking reforms to remove smaller banks from the onerous regulations while keeping the country safe from unsound practices by larger banks?
That's a great question, and one of the first things I would suggest would be go back to Glass-Steagall. That would be how I would handle it. This puts the control back into place for little smaller banks, and also keeps the bigger banks from, as you just said, getting too big to fail. If they're too big to fail, they need to fail. One of our biggest problems is the fact that we got signed off onto this bill that they were too big to fail, and the fact that we changed laws after that. Once we did that, look at what has happened to your economy ever since. Look at what has happened to your jobs. Look at what has happened to the people in your life every day, the people that you know individually. How hard are they having it right now? You can directly go back to, in my opinion, to the moment we got signed off on the banker bailout. It, in my opinion, is where the people of America were sold out the biggest.
Ms. Curry.
Yes, I would like to say that with the bailout of the banks, we would think that now we would see better. I know that there's still concerns now with Wells Fargo and what some of the things that they've done. It's really been a misuse and abuse. It shouldn't be any differences in the way a big bank versus a small bank is handled. I was a former bank auditor and regulations, and people continue to violate over the times that I did bank audit for the state of Arkansas. But you got to hold people accountable. So there's no excuse in the way that big banks would be handled versus what the small bank industry. But what we have seen is escalating costs that for an everyday individual like myself, we have not been able to get the loans and get the funding, and we paid higher fees. So I still think that there needs to be some collaborations done to go back and look at some of the laws that were in place prior to this change. And it would be important because we deserve better. The smaller people that pay all the high fees and are not able to get their homes refinanced, and some of those issues that are never addressed.
Corey, thank you. Mr. Hill, 2 minutes.
Well, when the financial crisis ended in 2009, the Congress asked for a study to be done about what to do about it, what caused the crisis, how to fix it. And the Congress, instead of waiting for the study, passed something called the Dodd-Frank Act 6 months before the study was even complete. And as a result, it swept in a lot of issues that I think have hurt consumers and actually hurt small community banks in our towns. Dodd-Frank has instituted too big to fail. It did not cure too big to fail. Dodd-Frank caused free checking to go almost to zero. It's very hard to get free checking in a bank now. The surveys I show, so about 50% of banks don't offer free checking any longer. And on the regulatory burden that Mrs. Curry talked about, absolutely. Small banks say they're too big to succeed now. The big banks are still too big to fail, but the small banks are too small to succeed because of this regulatory burden. And I've seen that as a member of the House Financial Services Committee, and I've taken actions to help get consumers credit. I had an amendment to change the rules for manufactured home lending in our rural areas, which were curtailed by Dodd-Frank. I changed a law that was passed overwhelmingly bipartisanly in the House to make it easier to get a home loan due to changes from Dodd-Frank. And on the investment side, I've tried to get more information and research to people to make better investment decisions on exchange-traded funds, also passed the House by a large bipartisan majority. How do we fix this? I think we should repeal and replace Dodd-Frank with something called the Choice Act, which people can read about out on the Financial Services Committee website. And at the core of that is an off-ramp for small banks and small broker-dealers so that they can have a better shot at helping consumers. And let's tailor this regulation and get more credit for consumers and small businesses and less regulation at a big bank level.
Mr. Hayes, you have 1 minute for rebuttal if you wish.
I don't think there's really much I can rebuttal on that. There's more facts being thrown out here or just statements, really. The real thing is someone like Paul Craig Roberts would suggest to you that you go back, an actual economist would suggest that you go back to something like Glass-Steagall. And that's kind of where I stand on some of these things. So I don't think we're going to replace it with anything, any more regulations to me is not the thing. If anything, we need to get the government out of almost anything we can. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bronner has the next question, and it goes first to Ms. Curry.
Ms. Curry, the national debt is approaching $20 trillion, and someday the bill will come due. When that happens, if one of your descendants were to somehow be able to come back to you and say, what did you do to keep this from happening, what would you say?
On our national debt, we should be able to balance our budgets. One thing, we've got to come back and balance our budgets. We got to look at some of the top budgets such as defense, transportation, agriculture, and figure out where, and even some of the other budgets, but those are some of the largest ones. And where there's extra monies built in, where we can cut the debt down, that's where we have to make sure that we have monies to reduce those debts. I know how important it is that we be accountable. And as a congressperson, if I'm elected, I would be at the table to go across the aisle to work with my colleagues to try to work out something so we could reduce our debt in an increment within, so say, put it on like a 5, 10, or 15-year payout, but also look at how that could be done on a percentage basis over the next 20 years. But we have to start at some point on how we can handle that. But you got to get control on it and look at how and hold people accountable for what's going on now in what they're doing with the debt structure.
Mr. Hill, 2 minutes.
Thank you, Steve. The $20 trillion debt is one of the reasons, as a former community banker and investment person, that motivated me to run for Congress, because I think all of us want to leave our economy healthier, the financial statement of our great country healthier. And so we have to reach agreement on how to lower the slope of that line and improve it long run. It's doubled in just the 8 years of President Obama. Can you imagine that in 240 years of our nation's history, that national debt has literally doubled in the last 8 years? And I think that's why so many voters are concerned about the direction of our country, how they feel about the opportunities for our nation going forward, how we relate to our country. The former Joint Chiefs of Staff said the #1 national security issue of the United States was our size of our national debt. So I support the balanced budget, a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. I've co-sponsored that legislation. I've urged it consideration because I've reached the conclusion that our elected officials in Congress and in the Senate need that discipline, that final stick to get this job done. We only vote in Congress on about $1 trillion of spending annually. Over $3.5 trillion, 75% of that spending is on autopilot, is a demographically based spending. And those programs in the out years have to be reformed for us to make a major impact on a targeting reduction of that debt. I also say that Congress must, every year, fight to pass all 12 appropriations bills in the House and 6 in the Senate, and try to cut spending by as little as 1% a year across that $1 trillion of domestic defense and traditional spending. And that's how we deliver the power of the purse. It's our ultimate constitutional responsibility as members of Congress.
Mr. Hayes.
I want to make sure I understand the question. You're talking about the $20 trillion debt, and what would I say to my children or grandchildren 20 years from now? Is that correct?
Whenever the bill comes due.
I would say first and foremost, at the time that it did, that before it became the 20 trillion that it is, that I had stood up and I had asked for an audit of the Federal Reserve. I tried to do as much as I could to further that. I think that if we'd gotten an audit of the Federal Reserve, we'd have a lot better understanding of what our true economic situation is. So that would be a part of it. I tell my children, when it came time, I stood up, I ran for Congress, I ran for other offices, I attended meetings, I went to the capitals, I told everyone I could, and I did everything I could to do a Paul Revere and get the word out. We're in trouble, we need to take care of this now, and I have no regrets for standing up as I have.
Ms. Curry, you have 1 minute for rebuttal if you wish.
I would just like to add an additional comment. I think we have to look at impacts from the various budgets as to how we can reduce, but I'm definitely in agreement with my colleagues here that we have to figure out how to cut spending. And I think that, we're talking about all of the budget to help reduce, but we have to put it in a balanced budget plan to make sure that we have some type of payout and do that on a consistent basis yearly.
Ms. Curry, thank you. Sarah, White Dakota check question first for Mr. Hill.
Arkansas's high employment rate is based partly on low-skilled, low-paying jobs. We have one of the lowest degree attainment levels anywhere in the country, and cost is a big obstacle to going to college. Do you support debt-free higher education?
Good question, Sarah, and I think you've touched on it. Is one of the best tickets we have out of low-skill, low-wage jobs and out of poverty for all of our people across the country, particularly here in Arkansas with our attainment levels and our poverty here, is more access to higher education. What I've seen is, and I'm on the skilled workforce caucus in the House with my friend Brenda Lawrence, Congresswoman from Detroit. And we are working together to try to find ways to bring more skilled workforce ideas through the Perkins Act, which the House just reauthorized and has gone to the President to be signed. We also reauthorized K-12 spending, which has some connectivity with pushing money to the state so they can use it the best way they can. And what I've seen in traveling the district is great success stories on both the community college side and the high school side. At Greenbrier High School, every student gets AP courses, and by virtue of that, the families get almost 2 years of credit to save that family money going on to higher education or a skilled certificate for a skilled type job where you have an apprenticeship and a mentorship. That's the kind of innovation at the state and local level that I like to see. And when Congresswoman Lawrence was here with me in Little Rock, we met with people working on those issues. And I met with all of our school superintendents about a month ago to talk about what are you doing to get people prepared for college so they spend less money so that they can get through in time and save money by being more ready for school. But we have affordable institutions here. I was just at the University of Arkansas Morrilton today. It's about $2,500 for a year of schooling there. And that allows somebody to work, get skills to lead a career and have an ability to raise a family. And that's the kind of experimentation and local work I like to see. People working together at the local level to make higher education more affordable and more accessible to people.
Mr. Hayes, 2 minutes.
I'm going to ask you to repeat that question again, please, Sarah.
The question is, do you support debt-free higher education?
Simply put, no. If someone has the qualifications and they meet certain criteria, I think it should be up to the school that they're applying to, and they should have a way to grant them possibly free education. But I think that should be left up to the individual schools. I don't think it should be up to the state. I think when we put the government into the colleges, we are possibly losing that individualism that each person has, and that the thing about striving, you know, life is an adventure, and as you go through life, you take on certain things, and sometimes you take on too much and sometimes you don't. Well, college is kind of like that too. Do you have the skills to go to college, or, as Mr. Hill has said, do you need to go to a technical type school? Would you be better off in an apprentice somewhere? Should that be debt free? No, I do not think so, unless the person who is offering it wants to give it to you free.
Okay, all right. Mr. Curry, 2 minutes.
I agree that we should have debt-free schools and some other angles that could be handling. And I appreciate Congressman Hill for sharing what's already being done. I know how important we have to do the career paths a little bit different in secondary and even in elementary school level. We've got to prepare the kids much earlier to be able to focus. And when you talk about AP versus pre-AP and just traditional classes, we have to be able to offer that opportunity to more children so that they can advance. Because right now what we have a little inequities in the way that some of the education is handled in some of our school districts. I know with my experience with the school district. So we have to make sure that children all have access to those opportunities to possibly advance. But one of the ideas that I do have, the concurrent credit piece is important in high school, as you go into high school, to either have the career focus or whether or not you're going to go to a 4-year college. So I know how important. So monies could be saved, not necessarily, and that would help with the debt-free part of this. Of course, we got to make sure that the funding is there coming from the national level through possibly the Perkins funding or through the U.S. Department of Ed on how that's funded. But I'm in agreement that that's not a bad idea, but we've got to start early on to make sure that all children have the access to it.
Mr. Hill, 1 minute.
Well, when families look at how expensive it is to go to higher ed generally, over the past 30 years, the inflation rate to go to secondary school, in other words, post-high school education, is much higher than the famous inflation rate for medical care. Unfortunately, we talk a lot about how the healthcare rate of inflation is high, but education expenses are high, and I think universities are trying to be creative to offer opportunities for people. The Pell program is a federal program that's particularly good for first-time students, and I've seen it work so successfully at Philander Smith and Arkansas Baptist College in Little Rock, helping people who've never had an opportunity to go to higher ed before take advantage of that program. But I completely agree with my colleagues on skilled trades, because 50,000 jobs are available over the next few years that don't require a 4-year degree in the STEM education area, where we can have our young people really pursue happiness at a very, very competitive wage with just a little bit of post-high school education.
Question, Lance Turner. First for Mr. Hayes.
Okay. Many Democrats have advocated for a $15 per year, or a $15 per hour, rather, minimum wage, arguing that current levels are too low to be a living wage. But business owners say increasing the minimum wage would be too expensive, causing employers to cut hours or even jobs altogether. Amid a slow economic recovery, how would you balance the concerns of employees and business to ensure that workers can support their families, but also that business can grow?
Well, first off, let me state I'm against a minimum wage, especially a $15 minimum wage, when most of your people who own individual businesses don't even make $15 an hour themselves. So that is a problem right there. I think if you're talking about big companies, manufacturers and such, car manufacturers and such, yes, $15 an hour may be, for that line of work, may be appropriate. But the person who opened up their local jean store down the street, and they're only making maybe $20,000 after they get finished paying all their taxes, all their little bills, their distributors, their vendors, things like that, and they're working their tail off. They cannot afford, they still need somebody to possibly work, because they can't work 60 and 80 hours a week. They have a family themselves. That being said, they need to hire somebody, maybe a as I grew up, we had future business leaders of America. You got out of school at 12 o'clock, you went to your job. That was the way I learned a great deal, was because businesses want to teach you. I think that's an apprenticeship, and I think it allows an apprenticeship. As far as a minimum wage, I think the market should dictate that. Do I think it should be taken advantage of by paying somebody $2.05 an hour or anything like that? No, but I also think people have the opportunity to walk away when possible.
Ms. Curry.
I do support a better minimum wage. $15 may be a little high, but to me, the incentive is to provide more to small businesses so they can work more incentive-wise to be able to offer a better pay. I think what we've seen so many more people be incarcerated because they haven't had the skill set. So I'm going to say this from an educational perspective. Because students have not been properly trained, that's in the system, we're spending far too much money on incarceration. So we have to figure out a way to invest better with skills so that we spend less money on incarceration and educate. But it's important that we provide that support to small business so that they'll be able to accommodate for the increase in pay. But people deserve better. And for some people that have a family of 4 to live on the minimum wage that we have today is very difficult. But I am supportive of an increase in the minimum wage, more of a living wage.
2 minutes for Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Steve. Of course, Arkansas in the 2014 cycle addressed this issue in a referenda and agreed to a phase-in of a changed minimum wage here. And I do think all labor markets are local, and I do think local people talking about their labor market is a better way to go than setting a federal minimum wage, which is we've seen in other federal rules, one size fits all is not appropriate in the complexity and differences in our labor markets. But I also am concerned about the impacts of a minimum wage that's too high, because it's a detriment to non-skill folks coming into the workforce for the first time, but particularly young people, high school students who are trying to get their first job and develop job skills to move up the ladder. And so that has to be an important balance. I believe that the CBO or the GAO has stated that kind of a high federal wage would cost over 1 million jobs, for example. Also, only about 4% of minimum wage earners are families. Most people, this is a second job, to help support a family, or starting out, as I say, and the real disproportionate impacts on young people, particularly in our inner cities and African American communities. I talked to a Burger King franchisee the other day. I asked him, I said, well, what's your pre-tax margin, before profit? And he said about 6%. I said, if it went to $15, what would your profit margin be? He said it would be 0. It would go from 6% to 0. I'd have to lay off people. I'd have to discount hiring more people. I'd have to raise prices for hamburgers, which hurts obviously people with lower incomes. And so there has to be a balance there. I think the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, is a better way to help poor families moving up through the economic ladder for higher skills and more opportunity.
Jill, thank you. Mr. Hayes, 1 minute if you wish.
Again, I don't think the regulation is the way to go. I don't think it's for the federal government to decide what I should be paid per hour or what I should not be paid. I think it should be, Mr. Hill said it himself, at a local level. It's not the federal government's place to set that. If they want to set the rules for their employees and the federal government employees, I think that is within their scope. But as far as telling me as an individual that I have to pay somebody a certain amount, that goes beyond our Constitution. It's not up to the federal government to tell me how much I can or cannot pay an individual. Now, if I'm abusing that individual, then that's a whole different issue.
Mr. Bronner has the next question. It goes first to Ms. Curry.
Ms. Curry, in recent years, power has moved from Congress to the executive branch. If your party's candidate is the next president, will your first priority be to the president, or will you seek to restore congressional power?
I think that it may be unfair to say we would change. I think that if the president becomes the president, they deserve being able to make that power and have that veto power. I wouldn't be in disagreement with that.
Mr. Hill.
Well, the Constitution enshrines the separation of powers between the federal judiciary, our Congress, which is the House and Senate, the legislative branch, and the executive branch. And over the last decade or so, there's no doubt that the executive branch has, in my judgment, exceeded its authority and has usurped the legislative branch authority in a number of areas, in regulations, in particularly in extending their power through executive order. Madison, in Federalist 51, in the debates on the Constitution, said, when one branch gets too big for its britches, I'm paraphrasing, ambition must counter ambition. And so we have the checks and balances, and all the legislative authority, all the spending authority, all the appropriation authority is lodged in the first branch, Article 1, the legislative branch, which has over 50% of the words in the Constitution. So I believe Democrats and Republicans must unite to make sure that the people's House and Senate have the balance they deserve under the Constitution. This should not be a partisan issue. This should be something that we both care about as the representatives of the people in our House, is that legislative and appropriation power be done in the legislature and not over at the executive branch. Just yesterday, Dodd-Frank's Consumer Financial Protection Bureau went to the D.C. Court of Appeals and was declared unconstitutional. And that was an act of Congress, admittedly, but it gives too much power to the executive. And in their decision, they were talking about how to rein in power. You've ceded too much authority. It's not on appropriations. The executive director cannot be fired by Congress. So they reasserted the parameters of a good executive branch versus legislative branch issue.
Mr. Hayes.
I don't believe in supporting the party by party lines at all. I believe in supporting the U.S. Constitution and what it stands for. Now, if the president, whoever it might be, brings constitutional things to the Congress to be approved, then I would certainly vote on that. If they are non-constitutional, no, I am certainly against that. You know, the problem with Congress right now is Congress has not taken hold. You don't see enough of them standing up there and saying, why are we not impeaching? Why are we not questioning this? Why do we continue to fund? And a quick thing on this is on September 29th, we had another spending bill come up. That it included everything that the Obama administration wanted in it. You know, and it was just voted on party lines, and our congressman also voted on this. So to me, the executive power has way overreached, and I think it's going to take a united Congress, and it's going to take them to negotiate together, which is what they were intended to do, to get together and stop executive action.
Thank you, sir. Ms. Curry, back to you for 1 minute if you wish.
I'd just like to say that I want to stand with the Constitution, but I also agree that it shouldn't be us fighting against each other, Republican, Democrat, because it really needs to be about the people and what's best for our communities and what's best and what is right to do. So I would stand in working with my colleagues to make sure that we get a better understanding on what we're supporting, yay or nay, in the way that that's done.
Sarah White-Kodachek, first for Mr. Hill.
All right. Nearly 8% of Black Arkansans are ineligible to vote this election because they're convicted felons. And our country imprisons more people than any other. 2/3 of U.S. inmates are people of color. Do you believe our justice system operates with bias, and do you support sentencing reform?
Well, I don't think on the surface that our federal and state governments, judiciaries, have tremendous bias in them against the citizens of the country. I do think, and Mrs. Curry referenced it a few minutes ago, that we need a better way for people who are incarcerated to come back into society through transition programs that work. I don't find Arkansas particularly inspirational. Here's $35 and welcome back to the streets. I really think our faith-based organizations working with our prisoners should give education opportunities, make sure people are drug and alcohol free, make sure that they have a plan upon leaving incarceration, and I think that will reduce the incarceration expenses, some $34,000 per year per inmate at the federal level, have a safer society, reduce the recidivism rates. I was up in Ohio this summer and went to look at their program in Cleveland run by the Salvation Army, and they have a recidivism rate of less than 10% on people coming out of the Ohio Corrections office. That's better for the economy, it's better for jobs, it's better for those families, it's better for law enforcement, it's a better reputation for the judicial system. And so, to me, that's the most important thing we can do reform-wise as it relates to people coming out of prison. Focus on that transition. I'll leave it at that.
Mr. Hill, thank you. Mr. Hayes.
Do you have a breakdown of any other races other than just the black race?
There's a study, but I don't have it offhand.
Okay, I was just curious because to me, felony in general, this is a problem for a lot of people who have been convicted of minor felonious offenses, or in some cases, they just cannot get it together and they have a felony on. The average American, in my understanding, commits about 4 felonies a year. There should be a way after you've served your time that if you have not committed a murderous crime or an extraordinary crime, you should be able to, after a particular, especially after you've already served your time, you should be able to apply and get back your voting rights. I don't think it limits you there. Now, does that include all your rights back to keep and bear arms and such? That would have to be looked at. If you had a violent crime, certainly not. But as far as, I think all of us, any of us who ever went to jail would like to know that when we got out, we had some kind of control over our life. And voting is one of the ways a lot of people feel like they have a little bit of control. Whether it always works out for them or not, at least they're getting a chance for their voice to be heard. And that's one of the main problems about America today. There is a whole group down here that feels like their voices are never heard. And they don't vote. You're exactly right. They can't vote. They're either felonious or they just are that low on the level they can't even get around to go vote. We have some major problems, and they're going to continue, and they're festering in our streets. They're festering from our children, and this is what we need to strongly look at. You think our children aren't paying as much attention. I assure you, our children are much knowledgeable about the fact that they feel like they are imprisoned more now than ever before.
Ms. Curry, 2 minutes.
I agree that yes, we need criminal justice reform. As I've indicated earlier, there's a study with the Cradle to Prison where kids are identified so early on after 3rd grade testing to possibly be slated toward prison. So I know from that, based on what we've seen with the populations of people that are in prison, there definitely has to be more put in place for especially nonviolent offenders. And you know, a lot of people probably have served jury trials, and I experienced hands-on where there were injustices in the way that the sentencing has been done. So we need definite reform in those areas to make things better. And once people come out of prison, I feel that if they are tax-paying citizens, they should be able to earn their right back to vote. So that would definitely be a recommendation, or one of the things I would want to work on if I go to Congress, to make sure that their rights are restored, especially in the nonviolent crime area. But we do need reform in the criminal justice area.
Back to Mr. Hill for 1 minute, if you wish, sir.
Yes, so the Judiciary Committee, Sarah, is looking at sentencing reform at the federal level, and I hope that sometime they will bring forward their best ideas on how federal sentences might be looked at for reform. I completely agree with my former education colleague in Little Rock about third grade. When I was chamber chairman, we helped promote something called Our Kids Read, which targets third graders, because third graders learn to read, and after that they read to learn. And this unfortunate study you cited is true. And it's up to all of us in our communities to break that cycle, to get that education focused upon, so we don't send our kids off down the wrong track. And finally, I would say that, again, I've been inspired by what I've seen right here in our capital city of Little Rock, and I introduced a bill called for historically black colleges and universities to get grants from the Justice Department to compete for transition education programs for people who are incarcerated.
Thank you, Mr. Hill. We are at that point in our broadcast tonight for closing statements, and as again was determined by the candidates themselves prior to the onset of the debate tonight, we will begin with Mr. Hill.
Thank you, Steve. Thanks to the panel, and again, thanks to UCA and the AETN audience in the studio here. When I ran for Congress in 2014 for the first time, I'm running for my second term. I spent 35 years in business, helping people grow businesses, expand businesses. I know what it is to struggle in a regulated business like banking. I know what it's like to struggle to raise revenue in a troubled economy, in a slow economy. And this has certainly been the slowest economic recovery since Harry Truman was president. So when I ran, I want to run for re-election because I want to keep going on the work for getting economic growth faster. Because if we have faster economic growth, that helps us with our budget deficit challenges. That helps us with our priorities for defense and non-defense spending. And I want to work continuously to meet our commitments to our seniors and our veterans. One thing I've learned the most about in my first 21 months of serving the people in the People's House is the challenges at the VA. And I have tried to be a voice for accountability in the VA, for helping them get appointments, having people who are bad actors and fake records get fired, have their bonuses clawed back. And so I want to continue on that march of demanding accountability at our Veterans Administration. I also want to stay focused on, as we talked about, to make sure that our small businesses have the capital to grow through the capital markets and through our banking system, so that we have not created a single community bank since Dodd-Frank passed 6 years ago. And it's time to repeal that act and replace it with something that will get capital to small businesses and help us create the jobs and careers that our families and our young people need. I'd ask for the people of the 2nd District to trust me and to extend their vote to me again for re-election. I'm humbled to have that service and be the people's representative in the 2nd Congressional District.
Mr. Hill, thank you. Ms. Curry, 2 minutes.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone that's participating tonight. Thank you to Mr. Barnes and the panelists for being here, and to AETN for hosting this. I want to say to the people of the 2nd District, I know so many things we are facing, especially the affordable health care, but I'm proud that 20 million more people are insured that would not have been insured. We need to continue to move in that effort to get the support that's needed. I agree that it needs to be tweaked, and we need to do that. I want to get a better opportunity for education to make sure that there's not so much confusion about public education versus charter school education. All kids need to be educated, and they all deserve that equal opportunity and the equal resources provided to all those school settings. I want to say to I'm a senior. I'm a proud senior. I would never increase my pay to not provide to the seniors, to do more for our seniors that have provided our path for us to be here. And I want to support all we can to increase and do better for our veterans, as indicated in their transition programs. I want to be a voice for the people, because so many people feel still that they are not represented at the table. People want a better pay, and I want to do all I can to increase that pay to hopefully a living wage. Remember Diane Curry for Congress in the 2nd Congressional District. When you go to vote, I would like to be your voice.
Ms. Curry, thank you. And Mr. Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Barnes. Congress has a lot more control over things than most people realize. They can control it through monetary means. But this upcoming Congress is going to have a world of things to consider, not including our foreign policy and what we are doing overseas in places like Syria. Just in the last couple of weeks, a general was asked what it would take to win in Syria or to achieve our goals. He stated World War III. Are we ready to go to World War III in Syria with Russia in order to achieve whatever goal it is we're trying to do by the regime changes and such? Over there in Syria, there was a peace council just last week on October the 6th that met, where they stated that we are the invaders. They feel like we are invading their land. They feel like we are occupiers. We have got to address these foreign issues and what our State Department has got us into, what our representatives have allowed to happen. Along with that, you're going to have Supreme Court nominations. It's going to be very important what the next 30 or 40 years brings as far as who you vote for and who they will vote for. I want to put people in office who believe in our Constitution, who believe in your individual freedoms, who believe in our republic and the republic for which it stands, and that's the way it should have been all along. We may well have more people coming up for impeachments. It is up to Congress to decide that also, and we should be bringing some. Obviously, we should have brought impeachments against quite a few people as of recently, and I think we need to get stronger, have stronger militias, possibly by constables, you know, instead of the federal government doing everything. I think our current congressman has had his chance. Let's term limit him. It's time to make a change. I thank AETN. I thank you people for your time, and I thank the moderators.
Mr. Hayes, Ms. Curry, Mr. Hill, we thank you for your participation tonight, our candidates for Congress in the 2nd District. And of course, thanks again to our panel of journalists for providing the questions. And most of all, we thank you for watching. We'll see you in a couple of years.
Major funding for Election 2016 AETN debates is provided by AARP Arkansas.